On August 18 at 8:00 a.m., General Lindemann surrendered command of the 132nd Infantry Division to his successor, Major General Wagner. At the same time, the sector held by this division was officially transferred to the 254th Infantry Division. General Lindemann addressed a farewell letter to his division, the 132nd Infantry Division. Commanding General, Division Headquarters, August 18, 1943. Soldiers of the 132nd Infantry Division. Called to other duties in duty, today I have surrendered command of the division, which I have had the honor of leading since January 5, 1942. I turned mentally to this period of time with great pride and satisfaction. From every battle, we came out victorious. In our attacks, we crushed the enemy troops, often to their complete destruction. In defense, we remained masters of the situation, never giving the enemy a single gun. After the battle for Sevastopol, the division joined together in 6 battalions and struck the enemy again in January 1942, and fighting in snow and ice, through mud and rain, defeated the enemy in the winter battle for Feodosia and threw him into the sea. After many victories in defensive battles from February to April 1942 in the area of Dolny Kamyshy on May 8, the division broke through the front at the position of Parpak and quickly made its way through Kamish-Burun to the harbor of Kerch, where we caught the last enemy transports fleeing from us. On June 7, 1942, the division was moved north of Sevastopol to assault Olberg. The new Host Heights were taken in a desperate fight under the most difficult conditions. After the storming of the bastion, the armored battery Maxim Gorky, considered at the time the most modern and fortified battery, and the capture of Fort Shishkov, the entire northern system of fortifications was in the hands of our troops. After our breakthrough through the battery tongue on the northern edge of the harbor, the division struck westward across the Chernaya River, and on July 1 captured the city in an unprecedented and bold attack from the south. After this success, a special message announced the fall of the mighty fortress. The division was then transferred to northern Russia, where the brave regiments immediately engaged 7 Soviet divisions in a brutal battle throughout September 1942 in the swamps and forests of the Gatilov Sack. At this stage of the bloody battle, all Soviet breakthrough attempts were successfully repulsed. In the defensive battles near Smerdenia in February 1943, the vastly superior enemy forces of 5 divisions, 2 tank brigades, and 2 rifle brigades collapsed before the iron defense of our division. Enemy losses amounted to 75 tanks because of the stubborn defense organized by the brave soldiers of the division who confronted the enemy, who was vastly outnumbered. In the last days of my command, the division successfully repulsed all enemy attempts to break through the main line of defense during the 3rd battle south of Lake Ladoga. In spite of the intense artillery and mortar fire, in spite of the endless enemy air attacks that took place day and night, brave men from all units of the division successfully repelled every enemy attack, inflicting huge losses on the superior enemy forces. Whenever called upon, the junior officers and non-commissioned officers successfully met every challenge, repelling and often completely destroying the enemy forces opposing them. The iron curtain of defense provided by our artillery units never failed us in the heat of battle. And thanks to our skill and professional qualities, we were able to repel the attacks of the most aggressive enemy, including tank formations. Often the enemy troops were demoralized or destroyed by our artillery before they came within range of our infantry's weapons, thus saving our infantry from the many casualties they would have suffered without this support. Our anti-tank units, through the skillful use of various weapons, succeeded in destroying 24 enemy tanks, 7 of which were hit by the infantry in close combat. This feat deserves my special appreciation. And in these examples, victory in defense was also on our side. Soldiers, on the march across the waterless steppes of southern Russia, in battles on the ice-covered or burning heights of Sevastopol, or on the plains of the Kerch Peninsula, in the mud and swamps of Gadelov, waist-deep in snow and Smrdinj, and on the blast-strewn territories south of Lake Ladoga, and in Nasia, everywhere you achieved the almost impossible. I would like to express my endless gratitude and special appreciation to my exemplary commanders, whose names will be forever engraved in the history of the division, as well as to the officers and non-commissioned officers, the steadfast fighters who fought hard despite the enemy's superiority, and whose countless feats often went unnoticed and untold, but were crucial to our survival and our subsequent victories. I thank all branches of the military for your endurance and your selfless camaraderie. As I now leave a division that is fused together in the fire of battles experienced across the expanse of Russia, my thoughts remain with our 4,520 dead who sleep eternal sleep on the banks of the Dnieper, on the battlefields of the Crimea, and in the forest battles south of Lake Ladoga. I know that the final words I once uttered in my very combat order as a division commander, faith in the trustworthy, have been repeated many times. I leave my old division with unbreakable bonds of comradeship and unity of spirit. I wish the division and each of its soldiers the very best of soldierly good fortune, and I end with appreciation. Hurrah for the 132nd Infantry Division. All for Germany. August 1943. Nasha Grund, Sandkal, Jewish Cemetery, Geisterwald, Porichi, Voranovo. These are the names of small battlegrounds that remained burned in the memory of those who survived. The deadly battles raged for days, weeks, and months in the forests and swamps near Leningrad. It was simply a firing range where many thousands of men and machines fought each other, soldiers killed without regret or mercy on this fiercely contested, mangled terrain. Minor crossroads were defended to the last bullet. A low knoll in the swampy terrain suddenly took on great importance and became a citadel where the soldiers fought desperately to the end. Countless brave souls had fallen in these rugged forests, forever lost in unmarked graves. Once there was a dense green forest with frequent undergrowth and majestic pines. The air was filled with birdsong coming from the abundantly grown bushes and from the tops of birch and alder groves. But then the armies came. The earth was torn to pieces and overturned by countless streams of bombs and artillery shells. The fresh green of the forests no longer dared to show itself to the light, lest it be destroyed again. Nature turned its face away in anguish from this picture of grenade and shell craters. Powerful tree trunks split by machine gun bursts. Forests set on fire by tracer bullets, where only blackened trunks remained, between which soldiers burst into battle, bent under the weight of military equipment, rifles and machine guns, canvas bags with a deadly load of hand grenades, steel gray-green boxes with belts of machine gun ammunition, anti-tank weapons and mines. In reckless desperation, they dodge bursting shells and seek the slightest shelter where they can shake off the ground. The jagged limbs of dying trees reach for the sky in agony, devoid of any growth and life in this man-made hell. In a sky clouded by the smoke and dust of battle, the sun is seen only as an orange glow trying to penetrate the air littered with debris and splinters. Once there was a stream here, crystal clear, forcing its way to the Volkhov River and eventually flowing into Lake Ladoga. In earlier years, intellectuals and well-to-do people from St. Petersburg came here to enjoy these lush forest canopies, where one could find refuge from the August heat and stuffiness of the city. And now the land of Nasia is crushed and torn. The once clear rushing stream is clogged with mud, stirred up and poisoned with corpses, those horrible splinters of war with which the forests are littered. The green meadows, fed by pure water, have become muddy swamps, stirred and poisoned by the evil that has fallen upon these places. The air is saturated and steaming with the stench coming from dead soldiers and horses ridiculously swollen from the summer heat. Formerly a village stood here, notable for its picturesque houses with tiled roofs covered with a layer of soft moss. The windows are framed with carefully fitted shutters and panes, decorated with fine carvings of stylized Russian ornaments made long ago. Houses usually have a covered entrance, bordered by benches. Here in the evenings sat Grigory and Ivan with Dunya and Tamara, smoking cigarettes and looking up into the evening sky, the very sky so marvelously described by Nikolai Gogol in Dead Souls. But the soldiers came. First the dwellings were destroyed. Only black ugly piles of ashes were left of them, from which a chimney rose clumsily and painfully in the soul. Soon a bursting shell, fired by a distant Russian gun, blew away this chimney and furnace, adding to the blackened ruins this heap of burnt brick and lime. Then the ruins were occupied by half a dozen grenadiers. They hastily drew their shantung tools from their belts and cut into the ground, burying themselves under blackened logs and ashes. They then piled bricks from a ruined chimney and dragged in a few broken tree trunks to reinforce their fighting position. Using the skill and experience gained from many previous battles, they built their fortress facing east and equipped a firing point in the ruins. Satisfied with the results of their half-day's labor, they set up their machine gun and prepared their hand grenades by removing the safety caps from the base of the wooden handles, then stacked them side by side in a neat pyramid. The soldiers opened their ammunition boxes, checked and loaded their rocket launchers. Then they waited for darkness, when they would have to repel another attack. Suddenly, the darkness of night was torn by explosions, the flashes of gunfire illuminating rows of ghost-like figures advancing rapidly through the forest clearing. The grenadiers clutched their hand grenades and crouched behind their machine guns. Their hearts pounded frantically. Terror gripped their limbs. Suddenly, the bullets of Russian machine guns snapped and whistled above their helmets. In one fell swoop, the soldiers of the machine gun squad pulled the caps of their hand grenades, threw the grenades into the darkness, and froze in anticipation. Over the small group carried explosive waves, followed by the groans of wounded Russians. Grabbing a machine gun, the foreman began firing short bursts into the darkness. The others joined him, opening fire with rifles and automatic rifles. The shouts grew fainter, and there was the eerie sound of bodies breaking through the shrubbery. It was the retreat of an enemy patrol. In the dim light of the magnesium flashes, the silhouettes of the attackers dissolved into darkness. The reconnaissance had been temporarily abandoned. The grenadiers crouched in their rifle cells and prepared for another onslaught. And the unmistakable throbbing noise of engines floated over the mangled terrain. The tanks were coming. German artillery batteries began firing volleys at enemy positions over the heads of soldiers in the ruins. The bursts of large-caliber shells drowned out the roar of the engines and the rumble of heavy steel tracks. The Russian tanks slowed, hesitated, and froze in anticipation. As dawn broke, an artillery raid began, raining shells from more than 1,000 of the enemy's gun barrels. The Russians dominated the skies, and Soviet aircraft dropped anti-personnel bombs and poured machine gun and cannon fire on the German positions. The grenadiers pressed hard into the ground. Huge chunks of brick and stone flew into the air. The earthen walls of the firing position collapsed on the heavy, dirty gray helmets of the grenadiers. The ground shook and trembled in agony. Some soldier thrust his helmet over his face, trying uselessly to hide from this nightmare of hearing nothing, seeing nothing, and feeling nothing. At that moment, the loader Grigory Bogatkin, Baltic Front, drove another 152mm shell into the already red-hot breech of his howitzer. This offensive was being led by the 364th Guards Division and the 35th Tank Brigade. The shell rumbled through the air, slammed into the ground and exploded, burying 4 shrunken soldiers in gray-green under a pile of earth and debris. Where the 4 had been hiding, crouched down in their position, a single crater remained. The lone hand protruded from the ground, on which a gold wedding ring gleamed dimly. As this hail of artillery and rocket fire moved forward, 2 of the 6 buried deep in the ground. The survivors came to their senses and stirred. They found themselves next to their MG, half covered in sand and rocks. Their tiny trench had collapsed under this shelling. Through the forest thicket, they could clearly distinguish the eerie and familiar noise of rumbling engines. The Russians were coming. T-34 tanks accompanied by infantry. Unclear silhouettes began to appear in the clearing from the edge of the forest. The two tried to open fire with their MG, the very weapon that had so faithfully protected them in past battles. But instead of the quick, sharp bursts so characteristic of German automatic weapons, there was only a single shot, then silence. The ribbon feed jammed. The commander turned the machine gun, and both desperately began to release the bolt. Putting all their weight on the weapon, they tried unsuccessfully to clear the chamber and to force the bolt handle back with their heavy army boots. The mechanism remained frozen, motionless. The rumbling of tank tracks drew nearer. The enemy was approaching. The shouts of "Hurrah!" of the attacking infantry could be heard closer and closer. One of the grenadiers jumped to his feet and rushed to another position in search of another machine gun, but found only an empty crater, on the edge of which only a loam hand stuck out of the ground. At that moment, Artillery Sergeant Ivan Chernikov in the lead tank of the 35th Soviet Mechanized Brigade pressed the trigger of his 76mm gun. Shrapnel severed both of the grenadier's legs below the knees. With a scream, the grenadier fell to the ground and began calling for help. But no one heard these cries, and he crawled to the rear, dragging the stumps of his legs behind him. The tank approached the already defenseless position. 2 bundles of grenades exploded under the heavy tracks, causing no damage. The tank ran over the machine gun nest of the MG, stood and, roaring the engine, turned on its tracks, crushing the cell, hiding from view all traces of the desperately defended position. T-34 rushed forward and smashed the German defense line until it met its fate. An 88mm shell from a camouflaged Tiger waiting under thick branches and foliage penetrated the turret of the Russian tank, tearing it off the hull, and the huge machine caught fire. The forest shook with the angry rumble of small arms fire, which gradually subsided. Another attack was repulsed. The 1st Battalion was no longer responsive. Shells rained down on the headquarters and buried the battalion commander, Captain Guzel, and the adjutant, Lieutenant Vogel, along with the entire headquarters. The radio station was smashed to pieces. The radio operators were killed. Many wounded men wandered or crawled to the rear, or were brought on cloak tents by soldiers who, hobbling, under a hail of artillery fire and mortar fire from Katyusha, rushed to the field hospital. Hastily I assembled a small group of grenadiers and prepared them for the attack together with the regimental reserve, which now consisted of only a combined infantry and sapper platoon. Moving swiftly through the deafening rumble of battle, we ran from one crater to another, firing machine guns and hand grenades until we reached Sandkal. There we captured a number of dazed Russians, many of whom were wounded and unable to retreat. The night brought no rest. Rockets hissed in the sky, illuminating the mangled earth with silver light, showing the way for the Russian bombers were to deliver their deadly cargo. The Jewish cemetery was defended by a small group of soldiers under the command of Captain Scheckenbach, and it was infiltrated in the rear by Russian assault groups. At night our liaison and ammunition carriers came under sporadic fire from the darkness. I selected with me 2 groups of old soldiers whose names were familiar to me, men I knew would never fail: Kammermeier, Gerfellner, Obermeier, Juckel, Muckelsdorfer, Feierstein, Wagner, Ganser, Martin, Goltzmann, Kurtz, Dozer, Gatch, Jip, and others. We quickly prepared for battle, stuffing the shins of our boots and belts with hand grenades and spare magazines for automatic rifles. 3 machine guns were taken. At the last moment we emptied a few flasks in a circle, hopelessly trying to quench our nervous thirst. We plunged into darkness and moved across the cratered field, running from cover to cover, firing into trenches and rifle cells, shouting and throwing hand grenades in front of us, right and left. Elusive shadows in protective brown uniforms appeared before us, figures in olive-colored round helmets with small duffel bags behind their backs, typical of Soviet soldiers. They scattered into the darkness like rabbits in the night, and we took 7 prisoners. We were followed by a group with supplies, and they found us in the Jewish cemetery. There we greedily pounced on the thermoses of food and silently devoured a modest ration of a cold sausage sandwich. The battle raged for 7 days and nights. The bloodied and exhausted regiments of the opposing sides refused to retreat or take a breather. Retreat meant defeat. To stop meant death. For the survivors of this hell, these swamps and forests, these mangled stumps and tortured earth remained searing memories of the battle, from which many left only through death. Eventually, on August 16, due to heavy losses, the bulk of the division was withdrawn from the front south of Lake Ladoga. The 437th Regiment remained in the front line, and on August 17, Colonel Count Schuren von Krozig took command of the 1st East Prussian Infantry Division, still occupying the forward positions. During the night, Colonel Kinsmiller, my regimental commander, arrived at the forward position at the command post of the 11th Company. The unit was still clinging desperately to its position in the Jewish cemetery. Over 7 long days of fierce fighting and under direct fire from armored vehicles, artillery shelling, and tons of bombs dropped by endless waves of Soviet aircraft, the captain, nicknamed Stubborn Ferdinand, refused to yield to the superior enemy attacking the heights of the Jewish cemetery. After the Soviet breakthrough in the left sector, his position became a stronghold and a major force in repelling waves of attackers, thus helping to avoid the collapse of the entire left wing. Although Soviet infantry managed to penetrate the rear of his position and entrench themselves in the midst of artillery and bombing funnels, the 11th Company continued to hold out. That same night, Captain Scheckenbach called in his liaisons. A 19-year-old messenger from the 2nd Platoon, Fleck, crawled across the overcrowded ground and ran from his platoon to company headquarters where possible. Although the landscape was constantly shifting under the incessant shelling, he instinctively found his way in the darkness, throwing himself to the ground and lying motionless, while hissing rockets lit up the sky. Fleck eventually arrived at headquarters, struggling to catch his breath, soaked with sweat. Slung over his shoulders and around his neck, he brought 4 Russian automatic rifles he had collected along the way from dead Russians, scattered across the moonlit terrain as he made his way through no man's land. These weapons were especially prized as a trade item with supplies from the rear, and an experienced grenadier would never pass up such an opportunity. Because of the Russian breakthrough, our supply lines have been cut, explained Stubborn Ferdinand. A mission was given to 5 liaisons: get through the Russian trenches and return with 2 days' supply of food. During this time, Colonel Kinsmiller finished his briefing, and the 5 liaisons were ordered to escort him back to regimental headquarters. The liaisons carried 2 thermoses of food per man, hanging one from their chests, and the other secured with reins on their backs. In addition to the German Mr. 40, or the Trophy Soviet Assault Rifle, PPSH, they took grenades with them, shoving them behind their belts and in the shins of their boots. So laden with their possessions, they plunged into the darkness. The colonel paced in the center of the group, holding his frozen hand in a characteristic pose behind his back. As the group made their way through the darkness across the tortured landscape, it became increasingly difficult to orient themselves. After walking a few hundred meters, the forward liaison had barely had time to approach the edge of a large shell crater before a heavy machine gun rang out almost point blank. Simultaneously with the hiss, a rocket flew up into the sky and exploded, illuminating the area. He instinctively threw himself to the ground, and at the same moment, machine gun bursts rang out overhead. He freed himself from the thermos of rations and rolled into the crater, where he found 4 soldiers ready to fight, the barrels of their weapons already peeking out from behind the edge of the crater, and the fuses already removed from their hand grenades. They immediately assumed they were ambushed, and prepared to give their lives for the cost of their lives. In the brief moment of silence that followed, they recognized muffled German voices. From the direction of the machine gun nest, a whisper came from the darkness. One of the liaisons shouted, "Don't shoot, we are our own." The machine gun was silent. In the crater, soldiers cursorily counted themselves. Someone was missing. A few seconds later, A liaison from 2nd Platoon found the motionless body of Kinsmiller lying 10 paces from the crater. The liaison pulled the body forward by the shoulders and wrapped his arms around the motionless officer's chest. The colonel's hands were clammy and warm. Others immediately came to the aid of the liaison. They unbuttoned Kinsmiller's uniform and discovered a wound directly opposite his heart. The 19-year-old Efrat carried his commander's body on his shoulders and wandered over to the MG machine gun nest. This machine gun crew from a neighboring regiment could not have imagined this catastrophe and lost the power of speech from horror when they learned that their commander had been killed by their own line. The situation in this sector of the front was so precarious that all sentries were forced to remain alert, keeping their fingers on the triggers in anticipation of another attack. Only a few hours before this accident, a Russian reconnaissance party that had infiltrated behind the front line had been repulsed in the same place, and any noise or movement in front of the front line was perceived as enemy activity. This tragic incident cost our regiment its most talented and respected commander. Colonel Kinsmiller had traveled with his soldiers from the time the regiment was formed in Lower Bavaria through the Balkan campaign and all the fighting in Russia. His death was a heavy blow to both the regiment and the division. 2 days later, he was buried among his soldiers in the cemetery in Sologubovka. It is said that the funeral was held in the presence of the division commander and the Army Corps with all military honors paid. This cemetery served as a burial place for the division during the 2 battles on Lake Ladoga, and next to it was the division infirmary. A large birch cross was erected in the cemetery in the shadow of a well-preserved Greek Orthodox church. A few months later, the German army left the area, and no crosses were left on the soldiers' graves. Often, in order not to provide Soviet intelligence with information regarding the military formations that fought in these areas, as well as to conceal from the enemy the names and number of fallen soldiers, any signs of burials and markers were removed from military cemeteries during the withdrawal. After the war, the Soviet government made an extra effort to destroy any remaining markers or monuments that the invaders might have erected in honor of their dead. Now those who had fallen in the vast expanses in the east lay in unmarked graves. While the army continued its attempts to satisfy on the battlefields the unflagging appetite of its military leaders, field officers and non-commissioned officers began to play an increasingly important part in the leadership of the fighting forces. But the backbone of the army was made up of the eternal old men of France, many of whom became non-commissioned officers. There was a joke that reflected the general atmosphere and the place that frontline soldiers occupied on the Russian front. Suppose the victorious armies return from the east, and on this occasion a grand parade is organized in Berlin. The marching columns are watched by thousands of spectators lined up along Unter den Linden, and under the Brandenburg Gate are magnificent ranks of troops in all their splendor. Ahead of them, all ride the generals and their staffs in dazzlingly gleaming staff cars with regimental banners flying. Right behind them follow the commanders of formations, accompanied by their staffers, with shining awards on their chests, with uniformed sabers at their sides. Behind them roll trucks of communicators, supply men. Then come out the batteries of field artillery, heavy guns pulling all-terrain vehicles and harnesses of polished horses, with all the harness polished to a shine and in perfect order. The whole procession is headed by Reichsmarschall Göring, dressed in a magnificent white uniform, trimmed with crimson and gold. From his neck to his chest hangs the Iron Cross with oak leaves. His entire entourage is seated in all-terrain vehicles for greater effect. The parade ends, the music eventually subsides, and the crowd, having been duly impressed, begins to disperse. And then, at a distance from the majestic parade, a ragged soldier, one of the perennial Efreatovs, comes into view. His cracked and worn boots testify to the distance he has traveled from the steppes of Russia. In a tattered and faded uniform, complete with bits of Russian military equipment, he flaunts a week-old stubble and is laden with a gas mask, tools, a bowler hat, a trench coat, a rifle, and hand grenades. The frayed and wrinkled battle ribbons pinned to his uniform speak of the many battles and wounds he received. As he approaches the Brandenburg Gate, he is stopped and asked what he contributed to the victory. He shakes his head. His face expresses confusion, and the reply follows, "Nix, I understand." He, the sole survivor of the defeated infantry regiments, having fought for years on the Eastern Front, had forgotten the German language. Older non-commissioned officers, when wounded or, more rarely, out of action due to illness, try their best to avoid being sent to a reserve company or to another newly formed unit. They know from experience that they have a better chance of survival in their old unit, where everyone knows each other and knows on whom their lives depend. Some units were staffed with officers and non-commissioned officers who had experienced hardship and fear together during the long years at the front, and for them the fact that they suddenly found themselves torn away from their familiar surroundings and familiar faces could have a traumatic effect. With every loss of a battle-tested fighter, the gap could often be filled only by personnel from rearguard, staff, or Luftwaffe units who had either little or no combat experience in infantry service. And when the ranks of the old veteran Afridiers dwindled, the casualties among the younger soldiers grew accordingly. One day shortly after we were replaced on the front line, a reserve group was sent to us. Some field officer brought the soldiers to their new company, and as usual, I talked to the newcomers, asking each of them his name, profession, what he had done in the past, etc. Among them were 4 soldiers from Alsace, and one, a short, sturdy sergeant, looked vaguely familiar to me. It suddenly came to me that this was the same kitchen bull from the reserve battalion, where I had received my basic training as a new recruit. I asked him if he had ever served in an anti-tank company in Darmstadt, and he cheerfully replied, "Yes, Herr Lieutenant." I further asked him to come by my company headquarters afterward. He arrived at the appointed time, dressed in full combat uniform, including gas mask and helmet. At first I let him relax by making light conversation, and then I told him that I had been a recruit under his command in the past. He immediately turned to attention, and a look of pain appeared on his face as I recounted the many instances of harassment and verbal abuse that my comrades and I had experienced under his tutelage. I specifically mentioned one interesting incident when he noticed 2 small dried coffee droplets on a large aluminum coffee can that I happened to be cleaning. After that, he began to berate and insult me, and I learned the importance of cleanliness to the well-being of the Army. I was forced to spend the rest of the day cleaning kitchen utensils until he was satisfied with the condition of each item. Here I patted him on the shoulder, giving him great relief, and drew his attention to the incredible trials one has to undergo before becoming a soldier. He proved himself a brave and very reliable soldier of this company. On July 22, the Russians attacked Zapenkov with superior forces, and we were thrown into action as a regimental reserve to patch up the breach. During the severe fighting, one 20-year-old Alsatian was severely wounded, from which he later died while being carried to the regimental hospital. That same evening, his platoon field sergeant collected all the soldiers' personal belongings. It was already a rule that one should separate the things that should be sent to the relatives of the deceased from those that the family would not need. While performing these unpleasant duties, this paramedic came up to me and asked to speak to me in private, and handed me a letter written by the dead soldier's mother. "Our dear son, here you were sent to distant Russia as a German soldier. There will come a time in France for us when the sun will shine again. We have heard that the Russians treat the Alsatians very well. A neighbor told me that she wrote to her husband, begging him to surrender to Russian captivity. Throw down your rifle and go to the Russians. Surely they will treat you well." Then came the words that distraught mothers write to their sons fighting far from home. Leaving this letter in my care, the field felon silently withdrew. It was my duty to pass this letter up the command. But I did not do so, although it was quite obvious that the author of the letter did not believe in, and did not want a final victory for Germany. It was also quite clear that the soldier's mother was willing to risk even her own life to save her son from the fate suffered by so many on the Eastern Front. I made a conscious decision not to add further hardship to the soldier's family. The fact that a disgruntled mother in Alsace did not support the German war effort or our political system surely did not settle the question of our victory or defeat in this warring world. Having lost her son, she had already suffered far more than a mother can bear. On August 28, 1943, I was celebrating my 23rd birthday on the operating table of a field hospital. The upper part of my left arm was hit by a shrapnel from a shell fired by a Russian artillery battery south of Lake Ladoga. Despite superficial medical treatment, the wound was infected, and it was suspected that the jagged steel had brought pieces of my uniform with it into the wound. After examining the wound, the regimental surgeon, Dr. Hager, ordered an operation for which he used anesthesia. This anesthesia was said to put the patient into a trance in which he honestly answers all questions put to him. When I came to, I learned that many of my regimental comrades, Fritz Schmidt, Buck, Duschel, Resch, and others, had gathered to witness the efficacy of the truth serum. Dr. Hager chimed in, and they looked very convincing, telling me incredible things I had said while under the influence of the remedy. Not surprisingly, most of the questions that were asked involved some experience in dealing with women. To avoid the usual effects of anesthesia, such as nausea and vomiting, I was given a bottle of cherry liqueur with the expectation that I would share it with everyone present. The evening of drinking and singing was interrupted only by new jokes and rumors, of which there were now many, on my account, of course, concerning my supposed social life as revealed during the operation. Despite the pain and elevated temperature from my wound, I remained in my unit until my leave orders arrived a few days later. I soon went home accompanied by Dr. Hager and Captain Tedel. At the end of our leave we met, as scheduled, in Lubin, where we boarded a train that took us back to our regiment deep in Soviet Russia. Units of the 132nd Infantry Division, withdrawn from areas west and south of Porichi, were moved to the Drakshevo area to operate in the sector previously held by the 81st Infantry Division on the Volkhov-Kirishi bridgehead. Except for occasional skirmishes between the reconnaissance teams of both belligerents and some firefights along the perimeter of the bridgehead, the area assigned to the division remained quiet. On August 27, Colonel Altman, commander of the 438th Grenadier Regiment, was killed while inspecting the front line of the Kirishi bridgehead. On September 11, without warning, it was ordered to prepare a plan for the upcoming evacuation of the bridgehead by the 81st, 132nd Divisions, and parts of the 96th Division. It was also supposed to leave positions in the area of Kusinka and Myagrai. On September 14, preparations for evacuation began. All excess material not needed by the combat units in the near future was either removed or destroyed, including reserve artillery and technical equipment and fuel. The transportation of materials was done in 5 days, and upon completion of the final work, all property of value to the enemy was prepared for destruction by sapper units. The sky was covered with thick black smoke when the soldiers, preparing for withdrawal, began to methodically burn all the materials and equipment left on the site. According to the plan for the evacuation and withdrawal of combat units required 5 days. In order to prevent the enemy from guessing the retreat, some nodes were turned into strongholds, which were to be left only in the final phase of the operation. Among these strongholds were some areas within the Kirishi bridgehead and important positions along the railroad. The evacuation order began to be carried out on the night of October 1–2 with the withdrawal of the 2nd Company of the 437th Grenadier Regiment, which was considered a reserve on the bridgehead. Only one railroad was available for the withdrawal of an entire division, now consisting mainly of horse-drawn artillery and infantry without vehicles. Nevertheless, the evacuation was carried out flawlessly, without interference from the enemy, and without loss of men or equipment. Meanwhile, the front line was held for another 24 hours, until the grenadiers abandoned their positions at midnight. Soon after the last platoons departed the sack, the enemy began cautiously scouting the empty German positions with reconnaissance patrols and light infantry units. However, there were no large-scale movements of enemy troops until the afternoon of October 5, when tanks encircled with infantry were seen moving into the Ursa Dobrovo area, and they were soon covered by artillery fire. After the last battle-weary soldiers crossed the Volkhov at night from October 2 to 3, explosive devices were detonated, completely destroying the railroad bridge, which became unusable by the enemy. By midnight on October 5, the division occupied new positions in Kusinka and completed preparations for defense. With the withdrawal of the last rearguard units of the 437th Grenadier Regiment and the 132nd Reconnaissance Battalion by the morning of October 6, Operation Hubertusjagd came to an end. That month we still received propaganda leaflets from the Red Army. To the soldiers of the 7th Company of the 437th Infantry Regiment of the 132nd Infantry Division. German soldiers, Hitler has led you to disaster. In attempts to hide this fact, your high command is talking about flexible defense and reducing the front line. The Hitler clique has been waging war on the Eastern Front for 2 years, in which millions of young Germans have been killed and millions more have become widows and orphans, and only for the sake of the so-called shortening of the front line. You can judge for yourself the conquests of flexible defense, while the Red Army had already pushed the Germans back beyond the banks of the Dnieper. It occupied the city of Zaporizhzhia, cut off Crimea, and now successfully fights in the suburbs of Kiev and Gomel. The German army is dying of blood loss on the Eastern Front. The fascist dictators have already declared that you must sacrifice yourselves for the victory of the Blitzkrieg. Now they declare that you must fight to the last man for the success of flexible defense. You can easily spot the lies of the fascists. But what price must you continue to pay? Here are a few facts from the tragic history of your company. November 2 to 7, 1941. During the battle near Bakhchisarai, the company lost at least 62 soldiers out of a total of 180 men. The company was reinforced and after a short break was thrown into the battle for Sevastopol. After this phase of fighting, only 16 men remained. In September 1942, the company was reformed, its losses were replenished on the Volkhov front, and it entered the battle at Gatilov on Miga. After these battles, only 15 men remained out of 100 men. October 11, 1943. The 7th Company was already withdrawn to the rear when it was again ordered to hastily support the 121st Airfield Division. Your commanders unnecessarily threw you into counterattacks which cost you heavy casualties and defeat. The 7th Company was repulsed and left a third of its soldiers lying on the battlefield. Soldiers, you are shedding your blood for Hitler, making a sacrifice that is of no use to yourselves or the German people. Nothing can save you from this beating. Abandon this army of Hitler's enslavers, or you will be annihilated. The 26 soldiers of the 1st Company of your regiment, who together with their company commander, Oberleutnant Rudolf Kremer, surrendered to the Russians on March 12, 1943, can show you the way to salvation. For them, the horrors of war are behind them. After the war, they will return to their homeland safe and sound. Whether you will return to your families or as fascist invaders will be destroyed on the Russian soil depends entirely on your decision. Decide before it is too late. Often the propaganda services of the Russians used crude photomontages made up of pictures and names taken from personal documents, confiscated from German prisoners of war or taken from the dead. In our sector, as on all other fronts, Soviet aircraft dropped tons of such leaflets over our trenches. The soldiers enthusiastically collected them for use in latrines, as there was a constant shortage of paper for this purpose. The division's communications unit had a special reconnaissance and interception platoon. It sent specially trained teams behind the front line to eavesdrop on ground communication lines. Thus, it was often possible to intercept and eavesdrop on enemy telephone conversations. In this way, we could eavesdrop on the communications of Russian officers, and often through coarse speech, we guessed that women were playing an increasing role in enemy headquarters as communications technicians or supply officers. We also intercepted Russian propaganda. Once we intercepted a combat order sent to a rifle regiment that was directly facing us. The order detailed the plan and timetable for the capture of the important railroad junction at Kirishi and the largest match factory in the Soviet Union. Then, in another intercept, the plan for the attack on Kirishi against a heavily fortified enemy and its subsequent capture by brave Soviet soldiers was described down to the smallest detail. In reality, Kirishi was systematically evacuated by our troops even before the date of this order. On another occasion, we overheard a regimental commander scolding a junior officer for not taking booty during the battle. "How could I take anything?" The irritated officer excused himself. "If the Krauts took all the shit with them." One night, about 50 Soviet soldiers infiltrated through our front line. With great skill and cunning, they successfully sneaked through the fortifications with a sparse chain of sentries without firing a single shot. Having discovered the saboteurs behind their backs, the soldiers began to shoot from the left and right flanks, with 2 machine guns at the area where the enemy had infiltrated. Several Soviet soldiers were killed and wounded, while the rest fled in the darkness under the cover of their trenches. Not a single return shot was heard during the skirmish, and at dawn, examining the bodies of the Russians who had died under machine gun fire, we found that they had no small arms with them. In their stiffened hands, they were still clutching the open razors with which they were about to cut the throats of our sentries. On December 4, we were again on the offensive. Together with the regiment's reserve unit, I arrived at a small river that ran through a triangle-shaped wooded area. On our left flank, Schmidt's battalion was fighting hard, and directly opposite us tanks were advancing in our direction. I ordered absolute discipline in my sector, no noise, and to fire only at clearly visible targets when and if necessary. I immediately requested reinforcements in the form of 1 anti-tank gun with a crew, not yet knowing when to expect the arrival of this desperately needed weapon. Ahead of us and to our left was Firestein's division, holding commanding heights over the battlefield and space forward along the river. Suddenly, a machine gun started up from Firestein's position. A Russian company was already visible, moving along the river and providing support for the 2 T-34 tanks. Caught under fire, the Soviets retreated under the protection of the tanks, one of which immediately stopped abruptly and turned its massive turret toward the camouflaged MG machine gun nest. A direct hit from the powerful gun destroyed the machine gun nest, killing Firestein, who had served honorably for many months under my command. Other tanks immediately opened fire from the edge of the woods opposite us. Standing in a shallow foxhole with Yukol and Sepp, we were watching them through binoculars when a tank shell struck the tree next to our left, knocking it to the ground. Yukol slowly turned to face me, and I saw that only a small stump remained of the pipe that was always sticking out of his mouth. A shell fragment had blown off the rim of his helmet and cleanly sliced off the head of his tube. Muttering softly, "He got me," he slowly sank to the ground. His left arm was red with blood seeping through the fabric of his camouflage cape, and I unbuttoned his shirt and uniform and saw that a large shard had nearly amputated his left arm just below the shoulder. With the strap from the bowler, I pulled his arm tightly down a little below his armpits until it stopped bleeding. Yukol hadn't made a sound during all of this, but he was smiling faintly now, and I noticed that it looked like he'd finally gotten his long-awaited vacation with a trip back home. I helped him to his feet, and he disappeared, heading to the rear, stepping firmly without anyone's help. A few weeks later, I received a letter from the hospital in Vienna that began with the words, "My dear Lieutenant." Yukol wrote that except for the loss of his left arm, he was unharmed. He also added that he had no tobacco for his pipe, as tobacco was not considered a high priority in the hospital. This passage I underlined with a red marker from my clipboard and handed the letter to Hartl, the regimental officer in charge, asking him to send him some tobacco. To my great satisfaction and surprise, about 4 weeks later I received another letter from Yukol thanking me for honoring his request. The next day we welcomed the arrival of the 75mm ATGM and its crew. When we received the gun, we were greatly relieved, because otherwise we would have had no effective defense against the Soviet armor positioned opposite us. Once again, I found myself at the long-forgotten anti-tank gun, and familiarizing myself with the cannon, talked to its calculation. We carefully mounted the gun and lay in wait, but no tank appeared before us as a target. The next day, we crossed a bridge built of inflatable boats and thrown over a tributary that separated us from II Battalion. The enemy noticed the arrival of reinforcements and tried to move in with their tanks, 2 of which fell victim to our 75mm ATT. The rest hastily withdrew to cover. During the night, 2 tanks with infantry clad in armor broke through the trenches occupied by Schmidt. Some of our companies were thrown out of their positions, and I counterattacked with a reserve consisting of a reinforced sapper platoon of the 437th Regiment. We fought our way to a small hollow 150 meters from the spot in the trenches where the Russians had made the breakthrough. Selecting 2 squads for the counterattack, I ordered the rest, that is, about 60 soldiers, to lie down in the hollow about 200 meters behind us. The plan was to take as few men as possible in the initial attack in order to reduce casualties. The rest were to follow us after our initial strike. At a pre-arranged light signal, the forward observers gave our artillery the order to open fire, and in a few seconds our shells were already hammering the ground 30 to 50 meters ahead of us. As soon as the bursts moved forward and covered the enemy trench system, we moved forward and soon came under sporadic Russian fire. Somewhere quite near us, an automatic rifle began firing from a camouflaged trench, and one of the machine gunners was wounded in the shoulder. Wasting no more time, we rushed to attack the enemy positions, firing at point-blank range and pelting the trenches with grenades. I rushed to the edge of a trench less than a meter below me, from which the muffled voices of the Russians could clearly be heard where they lurked in the darkness. With fear sitting in their trench, they did not dare to look out over the berm, or they would have just dragged me into their trench. With a pounding heart, I pulled the caps off 2 hand grenades and waited until the last second before rolling them over the berm and into the trench below me. The grenades exploded, raising a cloud of dust and smoke, and holding my pistol out under the edge of the trench, I fired several rounds at unseen targets. There were cries of wounded enemies, and I rolled down into the trench, falling right on top of a wounded Russian. Shouting orders to the soldiers to follow me, Schorch burst into the trench, covering our left flank, firing bursts from the hip with his MG-42. Sepp, Gumpert and others rushed after me into the Russian trenches. From our position we could see a group of Russians on our right, who jumped up from the ground and dashed along the trenches through our fire further to the rear, to a tank lurking ominously in the darkness. Its silhouette was visible against the flashes of our bursting artillery shells. Within minutes, the Russians were knocked out of their trenches, and some of them began to seek refuge in the ravine. After we regrouped and prepared to counterattack, Sepp Sturm took a bunch of grenades and, running to the edge of the trenches, pulled the cords and tossed the grenades into the ravine one after another. The Russians left behind them a few killed and wounded, and we took 12 prisoners. After this attack by our little group, the Russians lost the initiative, and for the next few days showed no further intention of attacking. I immediately presented Sepp Sturm for the award of the Iron Cross, and this award was presented to him the next morning by the regimental commander. On November 14, the 132nd Infantry Division in its sector of the Kusinki Front was replaced by units of the 92nd Infantry Division and the 12th Airfield Division, and we were transferred by railroad to Locke's Army Group to strengthen the front west of Neville near Postashka. In this place, the division was not immediately sent into battle and left in reserve to defend and reinforce the divisions that were threatened. Except for units that remained in the Izhikov area, all of its battalions were used to support the 85th and 329th Infantry Divisions. It was planned that the 132nd Infantry Division would attack westward from positions south of Lake Nevedro to support the 16th Army offensive in late November. This offensive was planned to encircle Soviet forces that had broken through south of Postashka. This offensive, which would clear the vital Shkeglovo-Lopatovo highway, using the 436th Grenadier Regiment, and parts of the 16th and 9th Police Regiments, was scheduled for November 29. In the face of superior enemy forces, the units advanced to their intended objectives, but due to heavy losses suffered in the previous months, when nothing was received in return, the offensive stalled. A second offensive was planned for December 10 after the completion of another supply line, reaching the areas of Idritsa, the railway station of Nishchaya, Lusha, and Lopatova. The division planned to use the 436th and 174th Grenadier Regiments for the renewed attacks. However, these plans never materialized because the division was transferred to Wagner's battle group, and together with the 3rd Estonian SS Volunteer Brigade and the Latvian Police Regiment from Riga was given the task of reinforcing the sector between Trissa and Lake Jasno. It was expected that the enemy offensive from the Nevel area would go through this sector and that the enemy would strike in the direction of Polotsk. This expected attack threatened the entire right flank of Army Group North. The new sector of the division, stretching for 50 kilometers, until January remained quiet, except for minor skirmishes of reconnaissance groups. All those weeks the units worked hard, strengthening and building defenses, roads and bridges. Because of the increased partisan activity in the dense forests that characterize northern Russia, the entire civilian population was evacuated from the rear areas. On January 12, 1944, the enemy struck the expected blow. During the first days of the new year, enemy activity was observed in the areas of lakes Neshtadro, Yasnoy, and Nevedro. The Soviets attacked in a northwestern direction, aiming to liberate Idritsa in the northern part of the divisional sector. The enemy quickly succeeded in positions weakly defended by foreign formations and police units and broke through to Pustaya, Lakes Mogilino, and Sviblo. The Latvian Police Regiment from Riga, operating farther south between Lakes Jasnod and Gisen, was able to form a barrier along the line Pusharitsa, Izbisha, Sagacia, Shuliatino, Diatli. On the evening of January 12, the Soviet offensive was halted, and the police regiment reinforced its positions, receiving help with equipment and men from the 132nd Infantry Division. The grenades exploded, raising a cloud of dust and smoke, and holding my pistol out under the edge of the trench, I fired several rounds at unseen targets. There were cries of wounded enemies, and I rolled down into the trench, falling right on top of a wounded Russian. Shouting orders to the soldiers to follow me, Schorch burst into the trench, covering our left flank, firing bursts from the hip with his MG-42. Sepp, Gumpert, and others rushed after me into the Russian trenches. From our position we could see a group of Russians on our right, who jumped up from the ground and dashed along the trenches through our fire further to the rear, to a tank lurking ominously in the darkness. Its silhouette was visible against the flashes of our bursting artillery shells. Within minutes the Russians were knocked out of their trenches, and some of them began to seek refuge in the ravine. After we regrouped and prepared to counterattack, Sepp Sturm took a bunch of grenades and, running to the edge of the trenches, pulled the cords and tossed the grenades into the ravine one after another. The Russians left behind them a few killed and wounded, and we took 12 prisoners. After this attack by our little group, the Russians lost the initiative, and for the next few days showed no further intention of attacking. I immediately presented Sepp Sturm for the award of the Iron Cross, and this award was presented to him the next morning by the regimental commander. On November 14, the 132nd Infantry Division in its sector of the Kusinki Front was replaced by units of the 92nd Infantry Division and the 12th Airfield Division, and we were transferred by railroad to Lok's Army Group to strengthen the front west of Nevel near Postashka. In this place, the division was not immediately sent into battle and left in reserve to defend and reinforce the divisions that were threatened. Except for units that remained in the Izakov area, all of its battalions were used to support the 85th and 329th Infantry Divisions. It was planned that the 132nd Infantry Division would attack westward from positions south of Lake Nevedro to support the 16th Army offensive in late November. This offensive was planned to encircle Soviet forces that had broken through south of Postashka. This offensive, which would clear the vital Shkeglovo-Lopatovo highway, using the 436th Grenadier Regiment and parts of the 16th and 9th Police Regiments, was scheduled for November 29. In the face of superior enemy forces, the units advanced to their intended objectives, but due to heavy losses suffered in the previous months, when nothing was received in return, the offensive stalled. A second offensive was planned for December 10 after the completion of another supply line, reaching the areas of Idritsa, the railway station of Nishchaya, Lusha, and Lopatova. The division planned to use the 436th and 174th Grenadier Regiments for the renewed attacks. However, these plans never materialized because the division was transferred to Wagner's battle group, and together with the 3rd Estonian SS Volunteer Brigade and the Latvian Police Regiment from Riga was given the task of reinforcing the sector between Drissa and Lake Jasno. It was expected that the enemy offensive from the Nevel area would go through this sector and that the enemy would strike in the direction of Polotsk. This expected attack threatened the entire right flank of Army Group North. The new sector of the division, stretching for 50 kilometers, until January remained quiet, except for minor skirmishes of reconnaissance groups. All those weeks the units worked hard, strengthening and building defenses, roads, and bridges. Because of the increased partisan activity in the dense forests that characterize northern Russia, the entire civilian population was evacuated from the rear areas. On January 12, 1944, the enemy struck the expected blow. During the first days of the new year, enemy activity was observed in the areas of lakes Neshtadro, Yasnoy, and Nevedro. The Soviets attacked in a northwestern direction, aiming to liberate Idritsa in the northern part of the divisional sector. The enemy quickly succeeded in positions weakly defended by foreign formations and police units, and broke through to Pustaya, Lakes Mogilino, and Sviblo. The Latvian Police Regiment from Riga, operating farther south between Lakes Jasnod and Gisen, was able to form a barrier along the line Pusheritsa, Izbisha, Sagacia, Shuliatino, Diatli. On the evening of January 12, the Soviet offensive was halted, and the police regiment reinforced its positions, receiving help with equipment and men from the 132nd Infantry Division. On January 14, the division received orders from the 16th Army to engage the enemy, who had broken through on a line from the southern outskirts of Dubrov to Alexandrov. This attack began at 20.00 and somewhat held back the enemy. On January 15 at 6.30, the enemy launched a counterattack with a force of 8 or 9 battalions on our weak sector, which was now defended by 3 understaffed companies. The enemy troops, with the powerful support of aviation, artillery, and many guards mortars, struck along the line Pusheritsa, Izbisha, Sagacia, Shuliatino, Podborizi. Local breakthroughs in the vicinity of Pusheritsa, Sagacia, and Shuliatino were stopped by counterattacks, and in the area north of Chaika and Lusha there was heavy fighting devolving into close combat, with field artillery firing direct fire. Throughout the day on January 16, repeated attacks on Diatli and positions to the northeast were successfully repulsed, and the 120 grenadiers defending Diatli were ordered to move to a counterattack at 1800 hours. By this counterattack, the enemy forces were driven back, and a wedge was cut west of Sagaria. On January 19, 1944, the division transferred its sector to the newly arrived 290th Infantry Division. February 1944, in the Dyatlov area. The thermometer shows -20 degrees. The Soviets have once again broken through a sparse line of German defenses. The weakened guard battalions, many of them composed of foreigners, were forced to abandon their positions under the onslaught of powerful enemy forces. On a winter night, I and my men marched forward on a well-traveled road. The grenadiers moved warily, holding their rifles at the ready. As the column made its way forward, the dirty white camouflage suits glowed faintly in the darkness. To help ourselves, we harnessed the horses to 3 sledges, which we loaded to the top with weapons and belongings. It was a completely dark night, and though our eyes had long since become accustomed to the darkness, we could hardly distinguish a soldier walking a few paces ahead of us. I tried to keep exactly to the planned route, at times resorting to the help of a crumpled map, for which purpose I examined it in the dim light of a field lamp, hiding under a cloak tent. After several hours of marching, we arrived at the headquarters of the Foreign Guard Battalion and left everyone confused after we tried to get information about the area. After several unsuccessful attempts to contact those in the positions, a German officer was found who was able to give us a little insight into the situation and the location of the front, so I was left to rely on my instincts. We set off further along the narrow path that led us southwest. A few hours ago, the regimental commander had ordered me to take up a new line of defense in a small, conspicuous section of this terrain. Our final point was a small height, called on the map the village of Diatley. As soon as we approached this village, we suddenly found ourselves under fire from machine guns and machine guns from the left flank. We began to shoot back, and the enemy weapons were immediately silenced. In the rays of the dawn, I began to search through binoculars for any huts and buildings that would give us the presence of the village. As the horizon brightened, I realized that we had passed this village in the darkness, the remains of which were visible just behind us. A victim of the war, this village now consisted only of a few blackened chimneys rising among the barely recognizable ruins of burnt huts. I spotted through binoculars a low fence and a well, indicating the location of a former dwelling, the remains of which were now covered by a thin blanket of snow. Quickly issuing commands, I sent Feldfebel Staffen and his platoon to the right flank. Feldfebel Bernhardt was left where we were at that moment, while we were setting up firing positions for machine guns in the midst of the village ruins. Rifle shots rang out in the light of the approaching day. As dawn broke, it became easier for me to assess my surroundings. The village was situated on a dominant height, with a gentle slope on all sides. At a distance of about 1 kilometer on another elevation was Staffen's platoon. While carrying out my orders, a platoon commander, unknown to me, fell victim to a Soviet sniper hiding in the woods, who hit him in the head with a single shot. Then in the morning we were cautiously approached by an officer whose red edging on his collar, clearly visible under his field tunic, made him look like an artilleryman. The captain introduced himself as the forward observer of a battery some 2 kilometers in our rear, and said that the guns were fully prepared to give us fire support. After this reassuring message, we continued our preparations for the inevitable Russian attack. The forest spent the rest of the day in silence. As we busied ourselves with converting a bathhouse dug deep into the ground into a headquarters, the forward observers joined us. As the temperature continued to drop with the impending darkness, I allowed the soldiers to change sentries to give them a chance to warm up. Making a fire would immediately draw fire from the enemy, and was therefore strictly forbidden. I had long known that changing sentries as often as possible kept them alert, and they were less affected by cold and fatigue. Even before our arrival, the Soviets had been plotting an attack on the Foreign Guard units occupying the area. With strained nerves, we lay in our snow-covered rifle cells and waited for darkness to descend upon us again. Just before midnight, we heard the sounds of commands and noises that could not be confused with anything coming from the Russian positions. Then came the stomping of heavy boots treading on snowdrifts. We froze in anticipation until vague figures appeared openly in front of us, and the MG-42 next to me opened fire with long, slashing bursts. Rockets flew into the sky, and the air was filled with explosions and shouts of battle. Tracer bullets flew in the darkness, with a deafening rumble, and with unerring accuracy began to fall among the attackers' shells of the artillery battery. The enemy was thrown back in the midst of the bursting shells, but before that my friend and squad leader Gerfelder was killed. The next day the enemy attacked again and was again repulsed. At dawn on the 3rd day we were still clinging to our shattered positions. Again and again rows of shrieking enemy troops tried to seize our positions, now supported by mortars and artillery batteries, which dropped a shaft of fire on us before each attack. I was required to hold a front line 1 kilometer long, and with only 40 men. On the neighboring right of our section of the front gaped a gap of 500 meters long, which, as they said, was held in the hours of darkness by some reconnaissance group. On the night of January 16 to 17, the Russians became active again. Under cover of darkness, they surrounded the village on our left with a large force, breaking silently into an area where we had no guards and striking at a small group stationed in that sector. From our position, we could see muzzle flashes and grenade explosions. About an hour later, Sepp Sturm appeared, crawling in the dark on all fours toward our position. He had a tangential wound in the shoulder, and his camouflage jacket, bowler, flask, and even his shantung tools were riddled with bullet holes from Soviet machine guns. In the evening twilight, a Russian squad captured our left flank, and Zapp hid in a ravine while bullets rattled around him, riddling his suit and equipment. He waited until the time when he would surely no longer be seen and returned to our position. We reinforced the shrunken perimeter around the bathhouse. I was standing in the darkness in a trench up to my chest when, just to the left, I noticed a light behind the hulk of a burned-out tank. The light behind us flickered for a few seconds, then it was gone for about a minute, and then the signal repeated. As I was about to send a group out and find out what the signals were, I noticed some 20 paces away about 20 to 30 silhouettes moving quickly toward the signal. I instantly opened fire with my automatic rifle at the figures, now vaguely standing out in the snow, and the alarm went up in our positions. All our machine guns were facing the front, and they could not be deployed at once on the saboteurs. We opened fire with small arms and threw hand grenades. I could barely make out the smoldering fuse of a Russian grenade that flew past me out of the darkness, and then I was swallowed up by the sensation of a soft fall, and I remembered nothing else. Consciousness returned slowly. My head was spinning, and I couldn't get my bearings. My legs just radiated pain, and I felt paralyzed, unable to move any part of my body. Gradually, it came to my attention that my jumpsuit had been thrown over my head. When I tried to move again, pain pierced every part of my body. Shivering from the cold, I reached up and pulled the suit off my head. My ability to see returned, and I was glad to see Sepp and Jukal leaning over me through the darkness, their familiar eyes peering out from beneath the clear contours of their snow-white Wehrmacht helmets. In the midst of the attack, they managed to pull me out of the direct line of fire and away from the Russians tearing through the snow. The Russians threw Molotov cocktails at the bathhouse. The stronghold on our left fell, and we were left with only 10 men in our sector. As dawn broke on the horizon, reinforcements came in the form of a field sergeant, accompanied by 25 soldiers who had been sent to us from the Silesian Division. With the help of these reinforcements, we retook the right edge of the village, in some 100 meters from which the Russians held a small hollow where they could take cover and escape the fire of our artillery. We attacked at dusk. We rushed into the attack and captured the enemy position without artillery support, and together with Sepp and Jukal I approached the hollow in which the Russian with an anti-tank gun was hiding. Just before I could make out the crouched body in the thickening dusk, he pulled the trigger and an incendiary bullet flew past me, setting my overalls and uniform between my arm and thigh on fire. I hit him in the chest with my rifle, and he fell backward, while Jukal rushed forward and pointed the barrel of his automatic at his face. The terrified Russian looked at us with eyes widened with horror and lay still. Raising him to his feet, Jukal ordered the radio operator to take him to the rear. The Russians quickly counterattacked us, popping out of the darkness and hurling hand grenades. A field sergeant from the reinforcement group, who had acted with great courage and reliability under us, was wounded by a bullet in the abdomen, being turned backward by the force of the blow before he fell. Again we repulsed the attack, and against a superior enemy we recaptured and held the village of Dietly. With the coming of day we, at the risk of being killed by a sniper's bullet, inspected our small battlefield. In a hit tank in our rear we found a warm shelter made of straw, and decided that either partisans or saboteurs had used this tank as a landmark to guide attacking troops through our poorly defended line of defense. It would be very easy to penetrate through the gaps in the defense and concentrate in our rear mass of attackers, which would easily destroy us. Only a light signal gave away the location and plan of action, and this discovery prevented our imminent doom. On another occasion, some loner with the distinctive insignia of a German officer on his uniform and the red artillery cant on his buttonholes suddenly appeared among us. His unexpected presence here on the front line without his usual uniform, and the fact that he was armed only with a pistol immediately aroused my suspicions. When I demanded that he stop and give his name and unit, he suddenly turned and frantically fired 2 shots in my direction. I returned fire with my automatic rifle, but he plunged into darkness and disappeared. It became evident that saboteurs were penetrating our defenses dressed in captured uniforms, and it was rumored that in some sectors attacking detachments of Russians were led by men dressed in our uniforms and speaking perfect German. It was known that sometimes our sentries heard pitiful calls for help from the Soviet trenches, uttered in perfect German. These were clearly attempts to take advantage of the soldiers' natural feeling of compassion for their comrades, to lure our soldiers to their doom. In February, with a reinforced infantry sapper platoon and a reserve company, I assumed command of the area northwest of Dyatlov. For the first few days, we suffered heavy losses in killed and wounded. The Russians were entrenched along a line stretching the entire length of the wooded heights, and their positions were 150 meters from ours. We were constantly threatened by sniper fire and immediately subjected to machine gun fire as soon as the enemy spotted us from their trenches. In an attempt to get rid of this source of anxiety, we called in mortar fire on the positions opposite us, but the Russians clung tenaciously to their trenches and continued their deadly sniper fire. I placed the heavy machine gun on the front line and carefully positioned the machine gun so that I could accurately aim the weapon at the point where I had last seen the blue flashes of sniper rifle shots in the early morning hours. In addition to the machine gun, we aimed our anti-tank gun precisely at the likely position of the enemy sniper. When evening twilight came, we were again under fire, and the machine gunner, on command, began firing, and the ATGM joined in. Riven after riven of 7.92mm bullets went into the receiving mechanism of the MG-42, and the gun fired high explosive shells directly at the Soviet trenches. We immediately repeated this procedure as soon as someone shelled us, and within a week we were told that we had the quietest area in the entire regimental sector. Indeed, our own scouts reported that the enemy sector opposite us had a limited number of snipers and machine gunners, and those only worked during the hours of darkness. At dawn, they immediately retreat back to their rear areas. And for the next few weeks, we did not suffer any losses in our defense sector. One evening in mid-February, I was inspecting the front line, and some machine gunner reported to me that about 30 meters from our position some large dog was seen. I inquired whether the dog was wearing a collar and whether any weight was tied to its back. The soldier replied that it was quite possible. However, because of poor visibility, he could not say so. And then I ordered to shoot all such animals without warning. In previous battles, the Russians sent dogs with mines tied to their bodies to our positions. These animals were trained to search for food under tanks and vehicles with engines running, and the fuses were triggered by contact with the hull of the vehicle. Using this tactic, the Soviets also sent animals through the barbed wire in front of our trenches, opening passages in our defenses or destroying tanks and other indispensable equipment. Explosives killed everyone within a few meters, and shrapnel could inflict serious wounds even at an even greater distance. The next morning I was inspecting the area in front of our position and noticed something that looked like the tracks of a large dog. That evening one of these animals was shot between our trenches in a place from which it could not be pulled. The following evening, as I was returning to company headquarters through our positions, a large animal jumped up some 10 meters from me and ran with an arrow into the twilight darkness in the direction of the enemy trenches. I fired from the hip with my automatic rifle. The animal somersaulted and froze motionless in the snow. At the same time, the firing from a Maxim nearby forced me and the sentries close to me to dive into the snow to take cover from the fire, but then were able to pull the dead animal out of the neutral strip. It turned out to be a full-grown wolf, which had probably been feasting among the many corpses lying between the Russian and German positions. The animal was stoutly built, with a sharp muzzle and powerful jaws. Its ears were short and round, and its thick winter coat was grayish beige on the sides, faded to light brown on the belly and almost dark brown on the back. Zapp skinned the wolf and attached it to the wall of our shelter with wire staples to dry after treating it with salt and birch ash. After a few days, despite its somewhat pungent smell, it was found to be clean, and Dr. Dozer rolled it up and took it with him on leave to Germany. Within a week, Weisgerber in Stuttgart had it professionally processed, and it remains one of the few souvenirs I have from my experiences on the Eastern Front. From March 11 to 12, the division, and with it the regiments attached to the 120th Infantry Division, continued to fight hard near Schwora. From March 13 to 19, parts of the division were transferred to the 32nd and 83rd Infantry Divisions. The battle in the Bulge continued to be desperate and brutal, and the besieged grenadiers stubbornly defended every meter of ground. From March 29 to April 4, the division continued to fight defensive battles along the line from Lake Nizhnorodrogov to Lobov. The Red Army made repeated attempts to break through the German defenses, but they were unsuccessful despite overwhelming superiority in tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The snow and ice slowly receded. On Easter 1944, a Russian company attacked across the frozen Lake Nizhnorodrogov, but was repulsed, leaving the ice strewn with the bodies of the dead. The captured Russians reported that the Soviets thought the western shore of the lake was poorly defended, and some of them tried to convince us that the lake was already impassable because of the recent thaw. We were well aware that the lake had ice up to 1 to 1.5 meters thick, and that it could be passable until late April or early May. On Easter morning, after I had left headquarters, having been briefed on the combat situation, the men of my company presented me with an Easter basket made from all sorts of items that could be found on our front lines. On a layer of soft moss was neatly laid out a dozen round, olive-colored Russian hand grenades that had been collected from the corpses of the attackers. This was how we celebrated Easter 1944. On June 23, 1944, the Russians struck Army Group Center on a front 400 kilometers wide. The entire central front from Vitebsk to Kiev was engulfed in flames. The Red Army, with fully manned, well-equipped divisions with strong support from armored forces, aviation, and impressive assistance from the United States, went on the offensive against the depleted German defenses at Rzhev, Smolensk, and further south. The Russians were now inflicting damage on the German army in exactly the same way we had done to them in 1941 and 1942 during our great victories. Because of Hitler's stubbornness, our generals could not take the measures so necessary to avoid encircling entire armies. An offensive of such enormous scale cut our forward lines. The enemy penetrated deep into the rear and cut off colossal amounts of men and military equipment, forcing mass surrender or destruction of trapped formations. In the Bobruisk cauldron far to the south of our position at Yukhnov, the encircled divisions were defeated and liquidated. The survivors of these gigantic cauldrons, which formed in the first days of July, found themselves on their bitter way to the Gulag and prisoner of war camps. The reasons for the collapse of the Central Front are obvious. We simply had too few soldiers, tanks, and reserves to hold the vast territories in the east, and our Supreme Commander-in-Chief in Berlin refused to accept this reality. No longer did our troops have divisions of the power that had won victories earlier. Regiments, which usually consisted of 3 battalions, now contained only 2 greatly weakened battalions. The engineer units and artillery regiments were similarly weakened, having suffered losses or lost some of their personnel to the infantry. In Germany, within the Reich itself, divisions were formed again and again in an attempt to hold multiple fronts against an ever-increasing enemy, but the old divisions, which had fought on the front from the beginning, were never fully compensated for the considerable losses suffered during the years of fighting. One of the most serious problems faced by soldiers at the unit level was that the most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers were either killed or seriously wounded at the front and were no longer with us. In addition, the Wehrmacht never fully developed and studied the tactics and methods of retreat. The German soldier was taught to regard retreat as a defeat only, promising no advantages. Even in the early years of the Reichswehr, the study of retreat, which could often be used to our advantage, was not encouraged. After 1936, even lesson plans for teaching withdrawal with combat were dropped from the training schedule. Attack and stand were the only methods of warfare that were drummed into us. In this sense, the Wehrmacht entered this war unprepared. The collapse of Army Group Center in June and July led to chaos. This was clearly manifested in the way countless units were seen on roads and bridges fleeing to the rear, seemingly without command and control, while at the same time other weakened units sought to fight their way through these crowds toward the front to engage the attacking enemy. Some of the broken formations succumbed to panic and rushed westward on foot and in vehicles of all kinds. Confusion, panic-stricken soldiers, congestion and obstruction of all traffic on passable roads would previously have been considered unthinkable, but the breakdown of discipline and order became a reality. The Russians were able to increase the disorder and confusion by carrying out constant air raids in which aircraft bombed and shot everyone on the dirt and railroads, causing the shattered, demoralized remnants of once proud regiments to scatter in their path in different directions. Strategic reserves could not make their way through this chaos to the front and remained huddled in a mishmash of vehicles and men. It became impossible to move entire formations, and the highest commander, to whose conscience this disaster should be attributed, was not present to see what his decisions had brought him to. As always, the brunt of these mistakes fell on the shoulders of the soldiers at the front, who paid for it with their lives.